Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View, and over the next couple of hours, we're going to, first of all, talk about kind of what is happening right now in Christian higher education. A very good conference just down the road from where we're broadcasting today, and we'll talk about some of the events there and some of the speakers, and be talking with the head of the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities. Then we'll get back into some of the issues in the news. Front and center, of course, will be the issue of free speech and censorship and some of those issues. A piece that we've put by Charles Cook of The Power of No, and we'll talk about that. Get into some other topics. The next hour, we'll be talking with an individual who is going to give us an update on what's taking place in China in terms of human rights. That's, of course, in the news. And then we will end the next hour with a good conversation with our friend Sheila Walsh on her new book. So lots to cover in these next 2 hours. But let me first of all bring to the microphone Shirley Hoogstra. She is the 7th president of the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities. Received her bachelor's degree from Calvin University, her law degree from the University of Connecticut School of Law. Actually practiced law in New Haven, where I used to live as well, and then served for a while as the vice president for student life at Calvin until she became the president of the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities. And she joins us now by phone. So, Shirley, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, I am so honored to be on your show. I know all about it. I've listened to it, and I am privileged to be able to talk with you today.
Well, we want to learn a little bit more about you, but first, although I think I've mentioned in passing the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities, probably have never educated my listeners about that. So could you spend just a minute or two explaining that consortium of universities?
I sure can. We are a worldwide consortium of institutions. We have over 185 institutions around the world. So we break them down into North American campuses, and we have about 150 there. And we're growing around the world, and we have over 30-plus institutions around the world. Let me just tell you what we do. We provide top-flight professional development opportunities. We tell the amazing story of our institutions. And we advocate for Christian higher education's unique Christ-centered mission in the courts, the legislature, and the executive branch.
And again, just some great material. We have information about this particular university outreach that is something that is tied into all these different campuses. We also have the forum that is taking place just down the road. It's kind of a who's who of people we've interviewed on this program. Senator Ben Sass, Walter Kim, N.T. Wright, who's a good friend of ours, Justin Gaboni, yourself, and many, many other people that I can mention. And it's on this issue of racial and ethnic diversity, and also, of course, the troublesome issue of human sexuality. So this is one of those events. I know that you have done some previous events, I think ones at George Fox University and some other places where you've addressed this issue before. It's certainly one of your issues. But explain exactly why this is coming together this week.
Oh, thanks, Kerby. So every 4 years, we bring the whole of the CCCU key leadership together, and we hold a day of plenary discussions because, you see, I think you would agree with me, when you're a Christian, you don't have to be afraid. And we have some troubling and difficult topics that we want our students to learn about, but we also want to be people who are informed through a biblical lens about how to think about race, racial reconciliation, prison reform, immigration, and then how, when we are integrating faith and intellect can we serve the world by being good truth tellers and credible partners on tough topics. So we're going to do that on Friday. We've got a great set of conversation, and we have N.T. Wright, as you mentioned. We have Brian Stevenson, who wrote the book Just Mercy, of course, has been doing racial reconciliation work, and Jamar Tisby. Just a number of folks in the morning. And then in the afternoon, we have some practical issues like what to do about enrollment.
And again, I might just mention we have a link to, of course, cccu.org and then /2022 forum. But you don't have to remember all that because it's on our website. And so just for a few minutes, let's get into this issue of diversity, because that's a difficulty when you start addressing Christian schools. You know, let's take a typical graduate from a university. He or she may be a Hispanic American, African American, thinking about going to a Christian university, Christian college. First of all, there's the difference in pay sometimes between that and a secular school. But second of all, of course, it is also the requirement for you to agree to, if you will, the doctrinal statement at Gordon College, Nyack College, Dallas Baptist University, Biola, wherever it might be, John Brown, Wheaton. And so in some respects, it's always been a little more difficulty for the various Christian schools to actually have that diversity on the faculty. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, you raise a really good point, Kerby. I want to just break it down into two parts. The first one is the student body. And it would be maybe surprising to some of your listeners to know that more than 40% of CCCU institutions are more than 40% non-white. So students who are non-majority students could really find a place with a great peer group. They would find also faculty members who are sensitive to the kinds of ways of conducting class discussions that don't make any student feel left out. In terms of faculty and staff, there are important both codes of conduct and theological understandings that we would hope all faculty that would join that institution could agree with. And yes, we are continuing to raise up through multi-ethnic leadership development, through faculty recruitment, because it is important, Kerby, for students to see themselves represented in the faculty. It's growing, but we would like to be even further ahead.
Well, again, that's, I think, again, one of the things I was going to get to, because the student body tends to be more diverse, not so much in the faculty. I remember an article I saw a while back about Newsweek. They erroneously didn't say that you ever had any non-white presidents. That's not true. But the bottom line is, if they're looking for role models, looking for individuals that they can follow, maybe even be inspired to pursue advanced degrees, that has certainly been one of the challenges. But again, that's one of the reasons that you're putting this course and this conference together. And again, just in a kind of a who's who of individuals. I haven't mentioned, of course, Harvard professor Robert Putnam. I can't think of the number of times we've quoted some of his books over the years, as well as a number of other individuals. So I thought we'd take a break. We come back, maybe we'll get into this in a little bit more detail, but also for those of you that maybe are thinking about sending your children, your grandchildren to college, or maybe you are thinking about going to college, one of the places which I would encourage you to check into is, again, this organization which spends a fair amount of time letting you know that there are other Christian colleges and universities, by the way, not only in this country, but worldwide, that you can consider, and I hope that you will do so. So we might also get some advice from Shirley about that, because some of you might say, well, I really want to study engineering, or I want to study the hard sciences, and I would think a Christian school would be good on Bible, but not some others. We're going to hopefully answer some of those questions that you might have as well. And of course, if you have any comments or questions about this issue of diversity, inclusion, and all the rest, those are topics being addressed right now on various campuses, and we thought it would be good for you to hear from Shirley Hoogstra about that. So again, you can go to our website, pointofview.net, or go directly to cccu.org to find some of the material that we're talking about today here on Point of View. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Years ago, I was near a beach when a tsunami warning was issued. An earthquake miles away under the ocean threatened to send a wall of water in my direction. It turned out to be nothing, but that didn't keep me from going to higher ground. Dr. Jim Dennison warns us in his new book of a cultural tsunami brought about by 4 cultural earthquakes. The philosophy of postmodernism has created a post-truth culture where truth becomes your truth. The sexual revolution has changed sexual mores. Racial identity is forged through critical race theory and other associated isms and ideologies, and attacks on Christians are encouraged and celebrated as a secular religion grows stronger every day. He explains how these secular forces also show up in the desire to pass the misnamed Equality Act and how major businesses have become woke. He even describes how these secular waves influence how we think about genetics and designer babies. The response to a physical tsunami is to retreat to safer ground. But Jim Dennison is not calling for us to run away from these waves, but to defend biblical truth, to defend biblical sexuality, to defend biblical equality, and even to defend biblical Christians. I would encourage you to buy a copy of his book, The Coming Tsunami: Why Christians Are Labeled Intolerant, Irrelevant, Oppressive, and Dangerous, and How We Can Turn the Tide. He not only is able to warn us of the danger, but he offers a prescription of proactive, biblical steps to redeem the challenges we face today. This is a book all of us need to read and apply to our current cultural situation so that we can turn the tide. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Time for a few more minutes, and we are privileged to have with us today Shirley Hoogstra, and she is again the president of the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities. Let me encourage you to go to our website, pointofview.net, or directly to theirs, find out a little bit more. And Shirley, just as we were going to a break, I said something I really wasn't planning, but I thought maybe I'll bring it up before I get back to the issue of diversity and inclusion, and that is, I have found that a lot of young people might consider a Christian college if they knew more about it. And what I find so often is we'll run into young people that are heading off to a university experience, and they said, well, I'd like to consider a Christian college, but I really want to go into medicine, and so it would really be, I think, a mistake to go to a Christian college to study biology. I'm going, no, that's wrong. I can point to some very good universities that are Christian universities where the students actually get a high percentage of those into medical school. Or they might say, you know, I'm really into computers and computer graphics and things like that, and that's something I'm going to have to go to a state school, but I couldn't certainly get that in a Christian school. I think what you have probably found, especially working with all these Christian colleges and universities, we can offer a top flight education, oftentimes in the majors that students are convinced only can be given in the major universities or state schools.
Wow, Kerby, you have that exactly right. You know, Christian colleges and universities are academically rigorous, and we could match program to program with any other school that most likely a student is looking at. For instance, like you said, our universities, when they do pre-med preparation, almost 90% of their students or better get into a medical school. My own son is a Christian college grad. He went to Calvin College, got a great foundation and worldview, went on to medical school, and is now a pediatric oncologist. My daughter went to a Christian college, got into the top social work program in the United States at University of Michigan. And that story is told over and over and over again. You must look at a Christian college. Number one, they are less expensive than almost any other private a Christian institution. And number two, you combine rigorous academics with the big questions in life through a lens of faith. Dynamite combination.
By the way, while we're talking about diversity, today's issue in National Review, how Michigan's ballooning DEI bureaucracy stifled speech and divided the campus. It's been a while since I've been on the campus there in Ann Arbor, although I have been there, especially during the snow. And it's interesting because some people are very concerned about the fact that when we talk about diversity and inclusion, sometimes it ends up stifling free speech. That doesn't happen on universities. So you really have to kind of walk the line and begin to figure out what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate. And I know that's one of the reasons why this conference is taking place this weekend.
It absolutely is. I think that when you are a campus of faith, you actually have freedom. You talk about this a lot, Kerby, on your show. Freedom to and freedom from. We are free from political correctness, and we are free to ask, what would Jesus have us do in terms of race and racial reconciliation? That is why the important topic of our day can best be sort of really studied, really taken apart, and think about it. Wouldn't you want your son or daughter to have this discussion with like-minded Christian faculty to really think deeply about an issue that must be addressed and will not be going away?
And again, I was just thinking about that because, you know, Jesus talks about in John 8 about the fact that we have freedom. You can think of the Apostle Paul in Galatians 5 talks about the fact we have freedom in Christ. But that doesn't mean we can say everything, because there's lots of verses, for example, that tell us that just because we have freedom and freedom of speech, if you will, we can't be engaged in lying or deception or filthy language or things of that nature. So there is a very significant balance, and you're going to find that in a university. You're going to see censorship oftentimes taking place in the state colleges. And so that's just another kind of important issue. And I know that one of the speakers that you have is an individual that we think very highly of. We've mentioned both of his books, and we interviewed him way back when he was just running as a United States Senator, hadn't even become a senator yet. But he's going to receive, as I understand, the Hatfield Leadership Award. Can you mention that?
Yes. Ben Sass is one of those individuals that is a deep thinker, and he cares about the issues of the day. And the Hatfield Award is one that has been we've had for a long time, that has honored people who are making a major difference in the public square for the well-being of citizenship. And we think Ben Sass is a great recipient of that award.
And I love the Hatfield Award. My mother-in-law actually went to school with Mark Hatfield, so it goes all the way back. That, of course, that just shows what an old fossil I am, and how much even older she was. But let's talk about this forum, because if some of our listeners say, this is something I need to know about. They may be actually a Christian school teacher, or they may find themselves saying, I want to hear some of the speakers. And you can't go wrong with Brian Stevenson and N.T. Wright, and, of course, your message, and Ben Sass and some of the others. How can people get involved? Because it seems to me that we wanted, first of all of our listeners to know that there is a Council for Christian Colleges and Universities. But if they go to the website, talk about what they can find there and how they can get involved.
Well, thanks. What's going to happen is some of these speakers will have their remarks on the CCCU YouTube channel. And so maybe that's something that we can get back to you, Kerby, on, or they can come back to our website and say, oh, there it is. That's what Brian Stevenson said. We can't wait to hear him. We can't wait to hear Jamar Tisby. We can't wait to hear Ibu Patel. And as you mentioned, Robert Putnam. And you may have noticed that we're going to be hearing from three very secularly positioned journalists from the New York Times, Washington Post.
Yes, I saw that.
Religion. Yeah, really. And we're going to ask them, well, what do you think about Christians? What do you think about Christian education? We want to learn from people who may see things the same way, but also see things differently. And here's what I bet you agree with, Kerby. When Christians show hospitality to people who may not fully understand their mission, they often get even a deeper sense of respect for what we're doing, and that's our hope.
Well, again, having been on the other side of interviews that I've done with some of the individuals that are with the organizations where I've actually not been interviewed by them, but others of their colleagues, the lack of misinformation they have about the Christian world and about Christian involvement in the world and about the cultural analysis and a biblical worldview are key. So not only can you extend that hospitality, but maybe clear up a few of the misconceptions that show up in some of the columns, the opinion pieces, and even in the news stories. So that is the case. Just before I let you go, any way that we can support what you are doing there at Council for Christian Colleges and Universities? I know that this is something I wanted people to know about and a good resource if you wanted to know more about Christian colleges and what they might provide. But how can we support you?
Well, the first thing to do is if you have any connections with a senator or a House of Representatives member in Congress, write to them and say, look, we really value Christian higher education, and we think that a Christ-centered mission is something that the United States government should protect and allow to flourish in America. That's number one. And then the second thing is to pray for us. With COVID on campuses, with the fact that every institution must raise funds from donors and other friends of the colleges to be strong, vibrant, and rigorous, we would appreciate your listeners' prayers.
I might also mention I'm holding up one of our most recent booklets we've sent out on church state. And in there, I talk about a few situations in which some of these Christian colleges, Gordon College and a few others that I've mentioned, have actually been attacked because they don't hold, if you will, the politically correct line on the issue, for example, of same-sex marriage or something like that, and recognize, again, the value of having separate universities and colleges that are Christian-based that really can hold to biblical ideas. So again, you might look at that booklet as we've sent it out to some of the donors. And most importantly, find out what you can about the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities. Shirley, it's a delight to have you on the program. I look forward to the next opportunity, and I wish you a very good conference, which is taking place just down the road from where we're broadcasting today.
Thank you so much, Kerby. It was an honor to be on your program.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll get into a couple of issues. We believe in free speech. But, the Bible doesn't actually have the words free speech there. The Bible doesn't have the words cancel culture. So how do we respond? And I've given you at least one very good article by Charles Cook, The Power of No. We recognize how important that can be sometimes, even in your own personal relationship. But I want to get into a little more detail that Shirley and I just talked about in terms of, what are some of the legal issues? What are some of the philosophical issues? And most importantly, what are the biblical issues? Then I want to get to another piece that we have actually posted as well, and that is the Great Lockdown Lie. This is a more detailed analysis of the survey that came out and the meta-analysis that came out from Johns Hopkins University about the lack of impact that these lockdowns really had and some of the devastating impact that they had. So some great material that we've posted. May get into a couple of other issues, and don't forget we're going to be talking about China and human rights abuses in China in the next hour. And of course, we'll also be talking with our friend Sheila Walsh. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Let's get to some of the issues in the news. Next hour, of course, we're going to be talking with our friend Reggie Littlejohn about what's going on in China. We'll talk with Sheila Walsh about her new book, Holding On When You Want to Let Go. But I thought we'd get to what's in the news. And what's in the news? Well, I did television a couple hours ago for a series, and the first question out, as you might imagine, was censorship and Joe Rogan. Okay, well, we understand that. But let's broaden it rather than just look at Joe Rogan, because we've talked about Whoopi Goldberg. We can talk about the cancel culture. Matter of fact, just a minute ago when I was talking with Shirley Hoogstra, we talked about in Michigan, they have a bureaucracy that really is stifling speech and dividing the campus. And so that has been a kind of an interesting phenomenon as well. And so that's why we bring to you one of the articles by Charles Cook. This appeared in National Review, and it's entitled The Power of No. Now, we all need to learn to say no. I oftentimes hear people say, Kerby, you need to say no a lot more to all sorts of opportunities. So that's certainly one aspect. But he's talking about no when individuals are trying to shut you down. And he says, I'm talking about no as in, no, I don't care if you're offended, go away. No, I won't punish others for your intolerance. No, you can't stay here and make stupid demands. I'm busy. You should be too. And he goes through a whole series of things in which people want to fire people because of some tweet that they posted, fire people or to deplatform them because they said something that was maybe unpleasant or you disagreed with. And of course, as I've tried to point out just the other day, and it's worth mentioning again, that it used to be hate speech. The argument used to be simply this: what you're saying is hate speech and it's not protected by the First Amendment. Wrong. Hate speech is protected by the First Amendment. As a matter of fact, the First Amendment protects a lot of things. Now, I've engaged in defamation or maybe obscenity or maybe incitement to violence. Okay, those are always very narrowly written. But the idea of hate speech has been used to justify getting rid of all sorts of individuals. But that doesn't work very well when you're talking about maybe masks or vaccines or whatever. So now that has been expanded beyond hate speech to say you should be fired, deplatformed, censored because you've been engaged in misinformation or disinformation. And again, one of the arguments that Charles Cook is using in his piece here is we always hear that the cancel culture comes from snowflakes. He says that's really not true. He said these people aren't snowflakes. They're vicious, self-interested power brokers who have discovered that by reciting a handful of carefully chosen words, they can exile their opponents for good. And one of the examples he uses is somebody I haven't really mentioned here, but a lot of people believe that an individual at Georgetown University, and again, I went there as a graduate student. This is actually, I believe, in the law school. Ilya Shapiro, he put out a tweet the other day arguing, I think, something we've talked about, and that is when the president says he's going to put a black female on the Supreme Court, doesn't that feel a little bit like an affirmative action hire? He didn't say it quite that way, but he said it in a way that actually was offensive to a few of the African-American students, and now we have this incredible outrage. And so the dean of the Georgetown Law School then had to come up and say, well, I've heard the pain and outrage of so many, and I was grateful to the many members of the community that reached out to me and other leaders of the school to share their thoughts. And Charles Cook says, no, the answer from Traynor should have been no. This is a man of incredible academic rigor. He came here, if I remember right, from Russia. He is an individual of very good character. You can certainly take one of his maybe poorly worded statements in a tweet out of context, but that is not the reason for you to get rid of him. And this is a word that I thought it was very interesting. Charles Cook said they should have used that at Disney Corporation for Gina Carano. Maybe New York Times should have used it for Donald McNeil. These are people we've mentioned in the past, or even Teen Vogue for Alexei McCammon, and goes through the long list of if we really stand up to what oftentimes are bullies, guess what? lots of times the bullies back down. Even if they don't back down, they tend to move on to something else. And he says, I think we'd be surprised that if we could actually teach these people that are in positions of power that all they have to do is say no and just give them a little bit of a backbone, then a lot of this cancel culture would go away. But how do we think about this? Because as Christians, I think sometimes we say, well, is that within the legal rights of individuals? And I would say, sure. The First Amendment, which actually gives you not only religious freedom and freedom of the press and freedom of assembly and freedom to redress grievances, it, of course, gives you the freedom of speech. And the freedom of speech says that a government entity cannot censor you or restrict you. But here's the issue, and here's the rub. Whether it's Spotify or Facebook or Twitter, or in the case of Whoopi Goldberg, ABC, they're not government. So they are private entities, and they could do what they want. So I'm not arguing that they can't do it legally. I'm really arguing that they shouldn't do it philosophically. One of the, if you will, liberal ideas was the idea that I disagree with you, but I will defend your right to say it. That is a phrase that has been attributed to Voltaire. He actually didn't say it. His biographer, Evelyn Beatrice Hall, actually made the statement. It was kind of a paraphrase of what he said. But when we talk about the liberal idea, and liberalism was what founded this country, they were looking at the writings of John Stuart Mill and John Locke, and you can go through the long list, you know it, and you've heard us talk about it here. They were actually arguing that the best way that we can find truth is by lots of speech and by robust debate. And so that has certainly been something that liberals and conservatives have held to. And not until fairly recently did that change. I mean, I can remember when I would speak on college campuses in the 1970s and 80s, there would be times when professors would invite me in and they'd say, you've had a chance to hear my viewpoint, but we're inviting Mr. Anderson in here today. He's representing a Christian point of view. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I wanted to give you a chance to hear a different viewpoint. Now, sometimes when I left, maybe they were critiquing everything I said, but the bottom line is there was an idea that there was an openness to various viewpoints. Is that true on college campuses today? Not hardly. And that's because liberals have been co-opted by the left. Now, the left don't really necessarily come from the Enlightenment. They more come from Marxist ideas. The left, since Lenin, have really tried to suppress speech. And so today you have a real distinction between what I would call liberals and the left. One of the people we've had in studio and also by phone is Dennis Prager, and I read his piece the other day. Matter of fact, I have this coming out in a commentary in which he says the left controls universities. There's little or no dissent allowed at universities. The left controls nearly every news medium. There's little or no dissent in the mainstream media, not in the news sections or in the opinion sections. The left controls Hollywood. There's no dissent allowed in Hollywood. And so we should certainly, from a philosophical point of view, applaud free speech and encourage free speech. Now, what about the Bible? As I mentioned just a minute ago, the Bible doesn't have words like free speech or cancel culture in it. But as we talked with Shirley just a minute ago, we do have freedom in Christ. John 8:31-36, the freedom that we have in Jesus Christ as believers. Galatians 5:1 and other passages talk about the fact that we have freedom, and we have a freedom to actually interact and debate and and to really begin to critique various kinds of ideas. Matter of fact, we're supposed to critique them because the Apostle Paul talks about it, 2 Corinthians 10:3-5, tearing down strongholds and lofty thoughts raised up against the knowledge of God, and taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. So we have freedom, but as I mentioned, we have guardrails because the Bible also tells us that we should be not engaged in lying or deception or filthy language or slander. But we are, if nothing else, to speak the truth in love. Ephesians 4:15. Matter of fact, today my commentary is actually a summary of this new book by an individual that we've enjoyed having on this program so many times, Jim Dennison. His book book, The Coming Tsunami. And Jim Dennison basically says his life verse is, I think, Ephesians 4:15, to speak the truth in love. And I think we really are called to actually be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. We see this in the Old Testament with the story of Esther. I mean, she could have stepped back and said, well, it doesn't affect me, only affects other Jews, but it doesn't really affect me. But she spoke out and saved a nation. We can think of Romans 12:21 talks about the fact that we overcome evil with what? Well, we overcome evil with good. And we are really challenged in so many cases to go out and to speak. We have to be good listeners. James 1:19, everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. And most importantly, we shouldn't be angry because you recognize that Proverbs 15:1, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Or how about Ecclesiastes 9:17? The quiet words of the wise are more to be heeded than the shouts of a ruler of fools. Do we have any rulers of fools? Maybe. Maybe that's why we need to speak out. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again for a few more minutes, and then next hour we're going to be talking with our friend Reggie Littlejohn, and she's going to be talking about what's been going on in China, and she spends some time obviously over there and has really worked over the years to deal with such issues as forced abortion. She's also been keeping track of the genocide of the Uyghur population, which are Muslims, China's social credit system, and even the issue of of vaccine passports and how that is used in China and why we might want to rethink some of that as well. I might also mention a very good piece that came out today by Jim Garrity we have not posted, Made in China, on the lab leak origin of COVID. And we'll talk a little bit more about that next hour because we do know a lot more about that. But one of the pieces that I thought would be really good to actually post is a video that was put together by an individual that isn't necessarily a conservative, but Matt Taibbi actually has put together what he calls the conspiracy theory mashup. And this goes on for about 9 minutes or so, in which he points out all the individuals that argued that the lab leak idea, that the virus, which we today call COVID-19, which originally had been called the Wuhan virus, that actually it may have indeed come from the Wuhan Institute for Virology. And this piece, which is just a long reminder of how many people not only dogmatically claim that it did not come from it, but then use that to vilify with a tremendous amount of arrogance, not just confidence. I'm talking about arrogance here, criticizing anybody that might have suggested that it came from that particular laboratory. And the target of a lot of that ended up being Senator Tom Cotton, but not exclusively. And very early on, it's like everybody just kind of fell under the banner of, no, this came from the wet markets. It did not come from the lab. It did not show any evidence of human engineering, when it really did. And as a result, everybody fell in line, and it just illustrates again why you need to read widely. Also, could I say, you also need to listen to point of view, because from the very beginning we said, I don't know, there's some concerns about this. We've got 4 amino acids that you don't find in nature all linked up together, and there are some various areas, I don't want to get into the genetics too much, but there were some places that just looked non-biological. They looked more like some kind of gain of function had been taking place. And so while it was true that the first SARS virus may have indeed come from something like nature or a wet lab, it was much less clear about this particular one, especially since the only place in all of China that we have this level 4 biotech and a particular facility was in Wuhan, China. And surprisingly, it shows up in Wuhan, China, and everybody keeps pointing to the wet market when, as time went on, they couldn't find any kind of virus or even scraps of the viral DNA or RNA anywhere in any of those animals that they actually measured. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that in passing. We'll probably get into the issue of China a little bit more obviously with Reggie Littlejohn in just a minute. And I do encourage you, if you have the time, this one takes 9 minutes. I always try to have a video that only takes a few minutes, but that 9-minute video is available on our website today. And I want to thank Matt for putting it together. I mean, Matt would disagree with us on a lot of the conversations we have around this table, but he's certainly dedicated to the idea of honesty and truthfulness. And so I thought that video was worth you taking the time to watch it. With that as a background, we also have another thing that has come out recently. And just the other day, you heard me try to read through quickly this literature review of the effect of lockdowns. And this comes from Johns Hopkins University, which has been kind of the gold standard here. Now, not all the people that are participating in this were at Johns Hopkins. Some of the authors come from Denmark or Sweden or even the United States. So this was what is called a literature review and meta-analysis of the effects of lockdowns on COVID-19 mortality. And what I can basically say, without going into all the detail, is this 7 pages, if you wanted to print it out, really helps us understand that the lockdowns didn't have the kind of impact that they were supposed to have in terms of reducing the mortality rates. But it did have a very devastating impact in all of the E's, the economic impact, the educational impact, and the emotional impact. Matter of fact, one of the reasons we'll be talking with Sheila Walsh about some of her books, Holding On When You Want to Let Go, and even her previous book, It's Okay to Not Be Okay, is we recognize the tremendous amount of emotional damage that has come from the issue of loneliness and depression and anxiety and the rest. And so this particular summary by Mario Loyola not only summarizes the article in some detail so that you can follow it, but then posts a couple of Twitter comments and a variety of others to actually illustrate again that this was not exactly what it was supposed to be. It was promoted as doing one thing. And it's possible that having a brief lockdown, we did maybe shift some of the pressure that would have been in the emergency rooms and ICUs further down. But actually, there is some evidence from this study that the lockdowns actually increased COVID-19 mortality. And I'm not just talking about what the former governor of the state of New York, Governor Cuomo, did, but also when you had shelter in place, you were oftentimes putting infected people next to non-infected people, not just in the nursing homes and everything that happened in New York, but also just in the small homes there as well. And so there is a pretty good evidence that indeed the lockdowns did not work. And if you say, well, why didn't you talk about it? Well, we did. We actually had a very good book that came out early on in this situation by Dr. Jay Richards and a number of others. You can see the review in which they were at the time saying, look, we don't see the kind of decreased mortality that was supposed to take place with the lockdowns. We don't see the decreased infections. All it seemed to do is maybe move them down a little bit. And so those particular states that were having more significant lockdowns, i.e. lots of times blue states, maybe they ended up with infections later on than the red states, but the reality was it was not doing what it was supposed to do. And on the other hand, it actually had some devastating impacts on all the things we've just talked about. So just before we take a break, let me again mention the fact that my commentary today is about this new book by our good friend, Dr. Jim Dennison. It's entitled The Coming Tsunami, and it looks at how we have tsunamis that are created by earthquakes. And these 4 earthquakes that he talks about are things like postmodernism, the idea of your truth and the post-truth world, the sexual revolution, the whole issue of critical race theory and racial tension, and even the attacks on Christians through a secular religion, and then spend some time talking about how that plays itself out in the political realm, and then comes back to those 4 different warning signs or earthquakes and gives us biblical ideas about what we should do in order to defend biblical truth, defend biblical sexuality, to defend biblical equality, and to defend biblical Christians. So it's a great book. We have information about that. We, of course, played the interview with him a while back, and if you would like to know more about the book, it is also on our website as well, and you can probably find it in your local bookstore. So some great resources we have there today, and we have all sorts of opportunities for you to connect up with Point of View, to even find some of the articles we've posted here today on the power of no and the great lockdown lie. We come back from the break. We're going to talk about China and then eventually talk about some of those emotional issues with Sheila Walsh that we are dealing with in our society today. All that coming up right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Back once again. Reggie Littlejohn will join us in just a few minutes. Before that, I thought we'd set up a couple of things so that even in the short time we'll have a chance to talk with her, we can certainly understand what she is talking about. And of course, the Olympic Games began on Friday, and they actually occurred in Beijing, China. Now, again, the concern about that is that many people have said the Olympic Games should never have been held in communist China in the first place. It ended up being a huge propaganda coup for the Chinese Communist Party. And again, I'll let you decide whether or not you want to watch the games or not. I haven't, but again, I feel sorry about that because I support the athletes who have worked their whole lives to actually hone their craft and do the best they can in front of an international audience. So they deserve our respect and they deserve our support, but also there is a sense in which this has been used by the Chinese Communist Party, not unlike what happened, for example, in the 1936 Olympic Games held in Berlin, Germany. By the way, just before Reggie Littlejohn gets on, let me just mention I have posted on our website, pointofview.net, the testimony that she gave in front of Congress, arguing, and this goes back, almost 10 months ago, but nevertheless, arguing that we should not have had the Olympic Games in China. So either we should cancel them or boycott them or move them or something. Of course, that did not happen. But in this particular piece, which goes on for pages, it reminds us of some of the reasons why we should be concerned about holding these Olympic Games in China. And a good illustration of that is for those of you that are a little bit older, can you imagine if by some chance the Olympic Games, maybe the Summer Olympic Games, had been scheduled for South Africa a couple of decades ago when we were in the midst of apartheid? And then everybody said, well, we'll just not send a diplomatic corps, but we'll send our athletes. I mean, can you imagine all the athletes that would say, no, by going to South Africa, I'm supporting this regime of apartheid. And if you think apartheid is bad, and it was, what's going on in China, as we'll find out from Reggie Littlejohn in just a minute, is even worse. And I think you can illustrate this in a couple of different ways. First of all, you can talk about, of course, the human rights abuses that are there. And she has, of course, been at the forefront of the one-child policy and the forced abortions and all that has taken place. Then we have, of course, the genocide against the ethnic Muslims known as Uyghurs. And then we also have this whole issue of the social credit score and system that is there. And I want her to describe it because I suspect there will be an attempt to move to something like this in this country. And that's something we've talked about before in the 7 Gray Swans book that was written by Chuck Bentley. But in addition, just think about the impact that it's had on the Olympic athletes. For example, our Olympic athletes have been told not to take their phones with them. What? Some people called it the burner phone Olympics because of the concern that the Chinese communists might compromise those phones. And so you have all sorts of things that just illustrate again what a brutal regime that it is. And as a result, I think illustrates why we wanted to cover this, because it's not really being covered very well in terms of the mainstream media, because their largest audience oftentimes is China. I was just reading the other day, I think this was in one of the news articles, about when they decided to do this remake of Red Dawn. Red Dawn years ago, that was Patrick Swayze and all those individuals. Actually, the first PG-13 movie, just a little trivia point. But when they decided to redo it, they shot it with the idea that not this time was the enemy Russia. The enemy this time was China. And when they shot that, people said, this is a disaster. This will, we're going to be censored by the Chinese and everything. So then they went back and shot some of it so that it instead, the enemy was North Korea, as if that's believable. But you can begin to see how these ideas have affected Hollywood, and Hollywood almost never is going to make China or communist China the enemy in anything. You can also see that except for maybe a very outstanding Muslim player who plays for the Boston Celtics, very few players for the NBA or any owners of the NBA dare say anything about China, and on and on. And it's just, again, an illustration of the fact that that's why we need to cover it, and we will be covering that in just a few minutes with Reggie Littlejohn, who, again, is with Women's Rights Without Frontiers. But while we're talking about that, one of the concerns that people have raised is, are we going to get to a point where we have facial recognition and we're going to have various people being tracked by the basis of their faces? And the reality is some of that already is taking place. But you might have heard the other day in which the IRS actually said that if you wanted to go to the IRS website, you now have to provide a photo of your government identification as well as a video of yourself for facial recognition. And when we first heard about it, we said, well, it's only for the IRS website. But as I dug into it, I go, okay, it's a little more concerning than that. Because, yes, you can still file your taxes. You can still pay your taxes without taking a selfie. But if you want to look at a tax receipt, if you want to look at a check payment, if you even want to see what your status is on a stimulus check or a variety of other checks, well, then you have to fork over a lot of personal information. And it turns out that the tax agency is not doing this. They've actually entered into a $86 million partnership with ID.me, and it's a private contractor. And interesting enough, they did that in November. But a month earlier, you had the White House Office on Science and Technology Policy actually soliciting comments on biometrics, which is what that is. But then it just looks like a month later said, oh, forget that. We'll just jump right past to that and make everybody take a selfie. And so now you've had not just conservatives and libertarians, but even a lot of Democrats in Congress that are against the plan, some because of privacy issues, some because academic studies have shown that facial recognition software doesn't identify Black and Asian faces very well. And, of course, what about the issue of hacking? You remember about 8 months ago when I talked about the biggest privacy breach in our history, in which you had the tax records of all these wealthy Americans? Well, ID.me says, well, we have tough standards. Yeah, so did every other company, including the federal government. So there are a lot of people right now that are starting to say, this idea of IRS FaceTime, that might be just too much. Sounds a little bit too much like what's going on in China right now, and we're really concerned about this invasion in privacy. We're not so sure that we should actually just trust a private contractor. We got this feeling that this could get out, and of course, you can change your password. Can't change your face very easily, can you? So, you can start thinking about all the issues that are starting to surface. And I'll have to say that some of the most liberal, progressive members of Congress in both the House and the Senate are also expressing their concerns. So this may be another time when you have, in this case, bipartisan opposition to an idea the IRS is putting forward. Let's take a break, talk about more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Years ago, I was near a beach when a tsunami warning was issued. An earthquake miles away under the ocean threatened to send a wall of water in my direction. It turned out to be nothing, but that didn't keep me from going to higher ground. Dr. Jim Dennison warns us in his new book of a cultural tsunami brought about by 4 cultural earthquakes. The philosophy of postmodernism has created a post-truth culture where truth becomes your truth. The sexual revolution has changed sexual mores. Racial identity is forged through critical race theory and other associated isms and ideologies, and attacks on Christians are encouraged and celebrated as a secular religion grows stronger every day. He explains how these secular forces also show up in the desire to pass the misnamed Equality Act and how major businesses have become woke. He even describes how these secular waves influence how we think about genetics and designer babies. The response to a physical tsunami is to retreat to safer ground, but Jim Dennison is not calling for us to run away from these waves, but to defend biblical truth, to defend biblical sexuality, to defend biblical equality, and even to defend biblical Christians. I would encourage you to buy a copy of his book, The Coming Tsunami: Why Christians Are Labeled Intolerant, Irrelevant, Oppressive, and Dangerous, and How We Can Turn the Tide. He not only is able to warn us of the danger, but he offers a prescription of proactive, biblical steps to redeem the challenges we face today. This is a book all of us need to read and apply to our current cultural situation so that we can turn the tide. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
We'll be joined by Reggie Littlejohn in just a minute, but since we've been talking about this idea of lab leak origin of COVID, let me again point you to the video, which you might want to watch. I recognize about 9 minutes long, and after a while it gets a little bit redundant, but I think that's part of the strength, seeing everybody saying the same thing and everybody very confident, really almost cocky and dismissive of anybody that might suggest that the virus came from anything other than a wet market. And again, to be fair, the wet market seems to maybe have been the origin of the first SARS outbreak, but then you've had others that were actually doing an evaluation of other kinds of species for, I think they were actually looking for a tick, but when they went to all the 17 different wet market shops, they just couldn't find any evidence of that. And so then they went out and started to look for naturally occurring animals in China that might have either the virus or a fragment of the virus in their bodies, which are called SARS-CoV-2, or what we today call COVID-19. Couldn't find it there either, and they went through a large number of individuals and animals to find that. And so you can go back to this idea that they said, well, this had to have been developed at the Hunan seafood market, And originally, when they were trying to do some surveys, they traced about 27 of the 41 patients to it. But when they did the larger study, they found that of the first almost 100 people diagnosed with COVID, only 49 of them, less than half, could be actually traced back to the seafood market. So that gives you just a little bit of the issue on the lab leak origin. But we are now joined by Reggie Littlejohn. She's been on the program with us so many times before, founder and president of Women's Rights Without Frontiers, a graduate of Yale Law School, international expert on China's one-child policy, and, of course, somebody that has been speaking out on everything from forced abortion to the genocide of the Uyghurs to China's social credit system and even the issue of vaccine passports. So, Reggie, welcome back to Point of View.
Thank you so much for having me back. I'm very happy to be here.
I might just mention one of the things we posted is your testimony that was in front of Congress, and that goes all the way back to May, China, genocide, and the Olympics. And, of course, at the time, you were arguing that we should move the Olympics or boycott them. Neither is happening, although we've encouraged our listeners to at least boycott watching them. But again, it's important to educate our listeners because the mainstream media doesn't want to talk about all the problems in China. But that's why you gave that testimony, and that's why you've been doing so many interviews over the last few days, isn't it?
Yes, I've been doing so many interviews, and thank you for having me on. And yes, last May, I was arguing at the U.S. Congress that actually what I was arguing is that under the Genocide Convention, that we are required to boycott the games because there's about 152 different nations that have signed that convention saying that they agree that if any country is committing genocide, that they will punish that nation. And probably the best way to not punish a nation is to award them the Olympic Games and then go and participate. So that was then. We could have moved the games. We could have delayed the games. Japan delayed their games for a year because of COVID. I don't know why we could not have delayed the games for a year because of genocide. But here we are. And in terms of the boycott, I really appreciate the way that you are encouraging your listeners, and I would encourage your listeners to boycott the games by not watching. And it's actually it's getting the message across. So I'm looking here online, and it says here the Winter Olympics ceremony was down 43% from 2018. Here's another headline: Beijing Olympics opening ceremony viewership falls hard. Okay, so this is a way of everybody voicing their protest that we're frustrated. There's nothing that we can do. We can't stop these games at this point, but we can stop watching them, and that will hopefully NBC will lose money, and hopefully the International Olympic Committee will learn to stop awarding China the Olympics.
You, one of the, as we go to your website, womensrightswithoutfrontiers.org, you don't have to remember all that because we have a link there. One of the posts is Biden's bogus boycott, because we were assured by the press secretary, well, we're going to boycott, but it's a diplomatic boycott, and that doesn't even strike me as a slap on the hand. What are your thoughts? Oh,
I completely agree, Kerby. So this is what Nancy Pelosi was advocating last May when I was saying we need a full boycott and others were saying we need a full boycott. She wanted a diplomatic boycott. So what does that do? All it means is that the senior officials like President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, et cetera, are not going to attend the game. But when we send our athletes, what that does is it gives Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party a platform to have an enormous propaganda bonanza. And their message to the world is that they are a fantastic country, that they're a beautiful country, that they're a civilized country. And in fact, they are the rising power in the world. They are the future. We are the past. I mean, ultimately, that is what they're trying to get across to the world. And so we just have to not watch those games and not give them that platform.
Again, one of the things that you say in your article, and again, it's the entire testimony, so it's 6 pages, and I would encourage people to print it out because even though it was given months ago, it's still relevant today. We do have a precedent here. And in 1936, we had Olympic Games in Berlin, Germany, and it was an enormous propaganda windfall for the Third Reich. And people sometimes say, well, you should never compare anything to the Holocaust, never compare anything to Nazi Germany. Just a few minutes ago, I said, well, just imagine if the Summer Games one time a few decades ago had been in South Africa. Do you think we would have boycotted those? Do you think all the athletes would have gone to those? And what's going on in China is worse than what you would have actually taken place even during the worst days of apartheid, I would think. Maybe not. But you are looking at what's going on in China right now. I mean, we actually do have genocide of the Uyghurs. You have this social credit score, which is locking down individuals. And before you came on, I even pointed out that the Olympic athletes were told not to take their phones with them because the Chinese communists would compromise them. So this has sort of been the burner phone Olympics, hasn't it?
Yeah. So this is another thing that Nancy Pelosi did on Thursday, the day before the Olympics started, which she said, well, we encourage the athletes not to say anything about human rights in China because it would be too dangerous for them, and the Chinese Communist Party is ruthless. I mean, she used that word. That's her word. So what are we doing sending our athletes there? And then, the United States Olympics Committee, other Olympics committees have told their athletes, rightfully so, that their phones, their computers are going to be surveilled, and they should not bring their personal computer or their personal phone over there, but use a burner phone like a drug dealer, okay, to keep their personal information personal. So, so if they have no freedom of speech, if they breathe a word about free Tibet or stop genocide, they could be detained, and the United States and the U.S. Olympics Committee and the International Olympics Committee, to my knowledge, have no plan about how to save an athlete that this happens to. So they're just basically told, keep your mouth shut and don't bring your personal phone over there. So why are we going over there? It's not safe for the athletes.
Let's talk about how people can connect up with you, because I always want people to do so. They might be interested in the Save a Girl program or Save a Widow program. They may want to express their opinion about China. We, of course, have our fact sheet that we've had up for a couple of weeks on the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics. We also have this testimony that you gave before Congress, but we also have a link to your website. And if people want to know more about you, what will they find when they land on the website?
Well, the Women's Rights Without Frontiers website is my main website, and that's the one where they'll find the Save a Girl and Save a Widow campaigns to actually save baby girls and abandoned widows in China. And then we also have a website that we have co-sponsored called genocidegames.org, and that's where you can get a kit, a toolkit to help with our online protest of these games.
So again, all sorts of resources available on our website. You'll find all those links. And Reggie, thank you for joining us. I know it's been a busy couple of days for you, and thank you for giving us some time here on Point of View.
It's always an honor. Thank you so very much for having me.
Going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk with our friend for just a few minutes, Sheila Walsh. New book out. It's been out for a couple of months, Holding On When You Want to Let Go. And I might also mention she's doing a Facebook live program tonight. We'll get into that as well. So maybe if you wanted to interact with her or listen to her as well, you can also listen online, but you can also listen right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
We conclude the final half hour here with Sheila Walsh, again, an individual that hardly needs much introduction, author of more than 30 books, sold nearly 6 million copies, co-host of Life Today with James and Betty Robison. And of course, in the past, I'm holding up her book, It's Okay Not to Be Okay, which is a book that I just highly recommend to individuals, and one that came out this September, Holding On When You Want to Let Go. I follow her on Instagram. Noticed even tonight on Facebook, she is doing a broadcast, a Bible study based on the book, Holding On When You Feel Alone and God Is Silent. So we do want to encourage you to get a copy of the book, but you might also connect up with her, SheilaWalsh.com. We have all the links necessary at the website. So Sheila Walsh, welcome back to Point of View.
Hi, Kerby. How are you?
Very good. Next month we will be at National Religious Broadcasters, and we will get a 50th anniversary celebration when Marlon Maddox started the show back in 1972. It's been 50 years, but sometimes people say, has anything changed? I said, two things have changed, and they both start with E. We tend to now spend a fair amount of time talking about economics because of all the economic changes. And number two, we're spending more and more time talking about emotional issues. And that's why we always so value your information, because you have helped us understand that we've always been wanting to minister to people with anxiety and depression and all sorts of suicidal thoughts and the rest. But after the 2 years of the pandemic, I think you would agree that this has gone from bad to worse, hasn't it?
Absolutely. And the thing that's really tragic is the statistics of younger and younger people who are contemplating suicide. I was talking to one of my friends who's a psychologist the other day, and he's trying to help the family of a 10-year-old boy who took his own life. Wow. I mean, to imagine that someone who is 10 years old with his whole life ahead of him, feeling so desperate that seemed like the only thing to do. It just makes me realize there really is a crisis in our nation, and that's why I think we as the church need to be the ones who are responding.
Well, and again, you have had an opportunity to address this because of some of the issues in which your life fell apart, and have really been a model for others to hold on in the midst of that. And in some respects, I think I've heard you actually say last time we had you in studio that this pandemic had an impact on you as well, didn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, Kerby. Honestly, that's why I wrote the book, Holding On When You Want to Let Go, because I was really surprised by halfway through 2020, I found myself really spiraling again, and I hadn't experienced that kind of depth of depression in a long time. I'm very faithful on my medication. There's several other things I know to do that are helpful. But as the weeks turned into months, I found myself just waking up each morning with such a sense of dread and watching the news, not even so much the national news, but watching local news. And I remember one evening watching this husband whose wife, they've been married for something like 40 years, and she was in hospital with COVID, and she was not going to survive, and he was not allowed to go and say goodbye. And I found myself on my knees in my den just weeping and praying for this family. So that's where this question came of asking the Lord, how do we live in these days? I knew how to live before, but it's like all the pieces have been scattered. How do we live when life has shifted so drastically?
I love how you talk about bringing some of those pieces together. And just for a minute, let me talk about the book. It's 10 chapters. First 5 are holding on when life feels out of control, holding on when you feel alone, holding on when God is silent, which is the topic you're addressing tonight, I understand, holding on when you're afraid, and holding on when you've messed up. Then you have held by the promises of God, held by God who rescues, held by God of miracles, held by the one who changed everything, and then, of course, let's go. And 200 pages. Baker, it's a book that you can easily find in your bookstore, but also we have information about it in case you would want to obtain it here through Point of View, or simply go online to find it. And, another individual who I know Michael Perrin, has been in the studio many times with us, Life Recovery at Prestonwood, and he has really said that these problems have exacerbated, so he really wants to try to get pastors to actually in their churches have a ministry in that regard. And so as much as you have been able to help individuals with your books, with your Instagram, your Twitter, all the videos and all the rest, it does seem to me that structurally another way to help people hold on and cling to hope is to actually have the church understand that this is a crisis issue that we need to address.
Absolutely. And that's why I was so grateful to our pastor, Jack Graham, for bringing Michael Perrin on, for recognizing the need. Jack interviewed me one morning in church about, depression, anxiety, and what he was surprised by afterwards was the number of people who came up and said that she was telling my story. And I think it was kind of eye-opening to think that, people show up on a Sunday and they're there to worship, they're there to lean in and listen. But they also come and they're struggling with issues. And so the fact that Jack brought Michael on has been such a gift. And I would so encourage any church just to have an avenue for people to be able to go, whether it's small group setting or to be able to tell the truth about their life. Because when we try to bury that stuff, we've buried it alive and it will deal with us until we deal with it.
One of the things, of course, I love about your book is it's full of scripture, but also full of your own personal experience. And whether you talk about messing up, being in loneliness, dealing with issues of fear, you start each particular section with some of that, as well as a suggested prayer. So talk for just a minute about how we might be able to use this book. This is certainly one that you can read individually from front to back. But the way you've put it together, I've also been kind of struck as I went through it on how it could actually be used as a small group Bible study. And so maybe that could be another way to reach out to people that are hurting right now, that are listening to us even here on Point of View.
Oh, that is so great, Kerby. You're absolutely right. In fact, I have written a Bible study for this, and that's what I'm doing actually each Sunday evening at 6 o'clock our time, Central Time, on my Facebook Live, Sheila Walsh Connects. First of all, I do like a 30-minute teaching, and then so people can join me. Last evening, we had about 22,000 people joining us, and they were from Australia, from South Africa, people in different time zones, but hungry for help. And so what we're doing is if people go to my website, SheilaWalsh.com, and hit free resources, then every single Monday we will send them what we did on Sunday night, but then also the Bible study that I did in studio. So it's all free. It's just an attempt to reach out to people and say to them, you are not alone. No matter how things appear, God is still on the throne, and we are loved.
I might just mention, too, when you go to SheilaWalsh.com, of course, you can sign up for the various updates and those kinds of things. And, of course, you can find out about the book and you can order it there. And we've made it very easy to do so. Lots of other free resources. So take the time to take advantage of that. Even though you may have missed it last night, you will certainly be able to get some of the material and get ready for next week or even go back and dig into some of that. But just before we take a break, talk about this whole issue of loneliness. We did a booklet a while back on this issue of loneliness. It's one of the chapters in there, and we even mentioned in passing in the first hour an individual that wrote a book years ago called Bowling Alone, and it seems to me that we've always been dealing with the problem of loneliness, but this pandemic has taken a chronic problem in North America and made it even worse, and that's why you devoted a whole chapter to it, isn't it?
Absolutely, Kerby, because we are made for relationship. If you think of the number of statements in Scripture about pray for one another, bear one another's burdens. We were not meant to do life alone. But I think one of the things that happened during the pandemic where, out of necessity, we were in our own homes. We couldn't go out for time. We couldn't go to church. And I think it just pushed people into a place where they suddenly felt so isolated. We saw that in our own son. Christian's in grad school, and for a year, all of his classes have been on Zoom, and it really had an impact. He paid a price. But the thing that's fascinating is it's not just to do with the current circumstances. It's something that we've experienced throughout our history. I actually begin the chapter with a verse from Psalm 13 where the psalmist David is saying, "Oh Lord, how long will you forget me? Forever, how long will you look the other way?" And I think sometimes we confuse that, it seems like the silence of God with the absence of God. We think that God is not there, that we are all alone. But one of the things we try to unpack through the book, and your books are always so, so helpful. I remember you gave me some last time, is to remind people of the truth, no matter what we may be feeling in any given moment.
Let's take a break. When we come back, some of you might say, okay, you diagnosed the problem. I want some solutions. So we're going to focus on some of the promises of God and how to grab hold of those and what that might mean. Again, there is much more to the book than we possibly can cover in a half an hour. But again, holding on when you want to let go. Sheila Walsh, clinging to hope when life is falling apart. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us for a few more minutes Sheila Walsh, holding on when you want to let go, clinging to hope when life is falling apart. 10 chapters published by Baker. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we also have a link to SheilaWalsh.com. You can find it there as well. But Sheila, one of the issues that I think people wonder about is, well, what do I do with these promises of God? I know oftentimes when I'm teaching in the chapel there at Prestonwood, I will say, well, here's a promise of God. You might want to put it on an index card and post it on your mirror, memorize it, or something of that nature. But you found those helpful because you start the chapter by talking about there really were two different sides to Sheila Walsh, weren't there?
Yeah, absolutely. Both for me, but there's sometimes an event that will happen in your childhood that changes your focus. I mean, there was the young me before 5 where I believed I could fly. I mean, I believed I could do anything. But then after my father's anger and brain injury, and then ultimately his suicide, I completely changed. I was afraid of everything. I was afraid of everyone. And it's why in later years, I ended up spending a month in a psychiatric hospital, because back in those days, my father was buried in an unmarked grave. We didn't talk about things like that. There was such a shame associated with suicide. And so I just stuffed all this inside of me and tried to carry on. And honestly, Kerby, my relationship with God was, I will try and be as perfect as I can so that you don't turn on me the way that my father did.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a very painful way to live. And sometimes, sometimes God will literally take you to a prison to set you free. I know of many people who found a real faith in Christ in prison. But for me, that example was ending up in a psychiatric hospital when I was about the same age as my dad. And yet it was in that place I discovered how greatly I was loved and that God had been with me all along. In fact, that's why one of the scriptures I include in the chapter on promise is that beautiful promise from Hebrews 13:5, where God has said, I will never fail you. I will never abandon you. And I love how my friend Dr. David Jeremiah kind of fleshes that out in his study Bible. He said that he writes that verse can be translated this way: I will never by no means leave you, and I will never by no means utterly forsake you. Never, never, never.
And again, part of the thing that you said, and you, of course, talked a little bit about your background, is one of your greatest fears is being left alone. So this is where, again, we can recognize that we will not be abandoned. But you also spend a fair amount of time talking about some of the other promises as well, because these are promises that are in Scripture for us to recognize that we need to forgive ourselves when we make a mistake. We need to depend on the Lord when we are fearful. And we ultimately, as you point out, have some promises. Nothing can separate us from God's love. Everything will work out for our good, and God will give us new strength. And so some of these verses, which may be familiar to us, we need to internalize them so that we don't just sort of have head knowledge. They have to be part of our spiritual life as well, don't they?
Absolutely. In fact, when you take that very well-known Romans 8:28, and you know that God causes all things to work for good to those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. If we take that literally and we apply it because it's God's word and it's alive, that means, okay, God, you've promised that out of every circumstances you will bring good. Not that they are good or that they feel good. That's clearly not what God is saying. But you promised you'll bring good. Therefore, I will bring all the pieces of my life before you that make no sense to me. My father's suicide, my struggle with mental illness, my hospital, I bring it all. And you've said you'll bring good from it. So I offer that as a sacrifice. For me, it's like learning to steward our brokenness well, not seen as a curse, but seen as a way that God has promised in the way that only he can, that he will bring good from it.
Again, this is a book that I think people can read through individually, but I do believe that this is something that if you can do this in a small group and you can gather together other individuals, you're going to see that all of us are a work in progress, right? I mean, we're all learning, we're all growing, and I know you from time to time get questions like, are you fixed, are you healed? Well, this side of heaven, no, none of us are, but there is a sense in which by sharing that with a body of Christ, not being isolated and interacting and recognizing that there are other individuals that can be part of your accountability group, part of the encouragement. They can help you hold on when sometimes you're ready to let go.
Absolutely. I have 3 women in my life who I call my safe sisters. And we, during the pandemic, when it was at its worst, when we couldn't get together physically, we would get together on a Zoom call. And sometimes I didn't feel like I wanted to do it. And they would get on the phone to me and they'd be like, Sheila, sit down in the chair and get on this call right now. And I would always leave feeling so much more encouraged and strengthened. We need one another.
Well, again, just a great opportunity to take this book, Holding On When You Want to Let Go. But I'd be remiss if I weren't also to mention the fact that you have some children's books, and I guess maybe because I'm a grandfather now, I'm starting to pay attention to some of those books as well. And one of those is God's Still Awake, a small girl with a big question about God. And so in addition to books that I highly recommend, again, I'll hold those up for those you watching online, It's Okay Not to Be Okay, and of course, Holding On When You Want to Let let go, I would at least mention for a minute that you have some children's books, and this newest one really is intended to get our young children, our grandchildren, interested in spiritual things as well, isn't it?
And, I actually wrote out of a real question in my own life. When I was 10 years old, I had gone to a meeting with my mom, and they'd presented the gospel, and I was really shaken by the fact that God would actually want to know me personally. So I went home and I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. So I came back down, and that's the very question I asked my mom. I said, Mom, is God still awake? And she said, why are you asking that? And I said, because I don't know what hours he keeps. I would like to become a Christian, and do I have to wait till Sunday? And my mom reassured me, no, God is open 24/7. So really, I wrote that book to let little ones know it's more about the presence of God. God is always with you. He's watching over you on your best days and your hardest days. God is awake.
If nothing else, if we want to teach the omnipresence of God, that's a book to use, even though it's intended for children. So, again, just thought I'd mention some of the books by Sheila Walsh. You can go to SheilaWalsh.com, click on the button that says books, and you'll see all the great resources there. If you'd like to get some of the free resources and follow her on Facebook, you can do that. If you'd like to know where she's going to be speaking, of course, all that is there as well, and you can sign up for her newsletter. So, Sheila Walsh, always a delight to have you on the program.
It's a joy to talk to you, Kerby. Thank you.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back tomorrow, we're going to get into some other issues in the news, because every day there are things to talk about. Phil Robertson will be with us tomorrow, Max Lucado, and then we'll still talk about some of the topics in the news. And if you find yourself saying, okay, you went through that a little quickly, I'd like to learn a little bit more about that again. We have information about the various guests that we've had on the program. Also have information about the Council for Christian Colleges. We have information about Reggie Littlejohn and China genocide and the Olympics, which was her testimony before Congress. The Power of No, which we talked about in terms of the piece that Charles Cook wrote about the cancel culture, and then also the one on the great lockdown lie. And maybe tomorrow we'll spend a little more time talking about the lab leak theory, but don't forget that tomorrow Phil Robertson, that'll be interesting. We'll be talking about his new book, and of course Max Lucado. Hope you appreciated the conversation today with Sheila Walsh. Again, you can go to her website. I would highly recommend both these books. It's Okay Not to Be Okay, Moving Forward One Day at a Time. She tells her whole story in that in a way that I think it would really be an encouragement to you or to people that you might be ministering to that are dealing with some of these emotional issues. So I think you will really appreciate that. 8 chapters. And then Holding On When You Want to Let Go, 10 chapters in which it's broken into 5 and 5. All sorts of great resources, and I hope you'll take the time to check out those books, read them, pass them on to others, and use that in your ministry. I want to thank Andrew for his help, as well as Steve for his help as a producer, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.